My name is Joanne Chula, and I teach at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. Tonight I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Nan Keohane. Nan, as many of you know, was the president of Duke University and the president of Wellesley College. She is certainly one of the most distinguished figures in higher education. Nan did her undergraduate degree at Wellesley, and then one undergraduate degree wasn't enough for her, so she did a second undergraduate degree at Oxford University. And then she finished with a degree in political science from Yale University, and that's where she got her PhD. She's taught at a number of fine schools, from Swarthmore College to Stanford University to the University of Pennsylvania. She served as the 11th president of Wellesley College and the 13th president of Duke. All in all, 23 years of being a college president, and she's still standing, which is remarkable. But as Nan will tell you, her most important things are that she is married to Robert Keohane, who is a noted political scientist who also teaches at Princeton University, and that's where Nan is right now as a recovering college president. She is also a grandmother with a number of grandchildren and is happy to talk about them, but we won't go into how many or what they do. Anyway, she's here to talk to us a bit about leadership, and she certainly had the experience for it, so all of us at the Leadership School are extremely excited to have someone with her experience and also her intellectual power at this lecture series. So let's give a warm Richmond welcome to Nan Keohane.
Thank you very much. That is indeed a warm Richmond welcome, although a cool, lovely evening. I'm very honored to be here. I'm a great admirer of this school. Anybody who teaches leadership has got to understand that the Jepson School is so central to what we do. So it's a special pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to talk about two faces of leadership, neither of which look like this beautiful icon, but you can sort of model there. Leadership out front and behind the scenes. As everyone at the Jepson School, and probably all of you all from other parts of the university and from Richmond are clearly aware, there are almost as many definitions of leadership as there are leaders or leadership scholars. Everybody has their own meaning of that word. In my book, Thinking About Leadership, published by Princeton 3 years ago, I use the term fairly broadly. And this is my definition. Leaders define or clarify goals for a group of individuals and bring together the energies of members of that group to pursue those goals. So defining or clarifying goals and bringing together members of the group to pursue those goals. Now, I argue that leadership in this sense is essential to all collective action. Talking to Joanne a bit earlier about leadership among chimpanzees, and I'm not going to get into that tonight. I know you've heard a lecture of that before. But against that background, I want to explore two very different types of leadership. Now, to provide a context, we should recognize that a leader can define or clarify goals in lots of different ways. You can issue an edict or a fatwa. You can bark an order. You can post a tweet. You can just have a thoughtful, subtle, persuasive idea among a group of colleagues. All are ways of defining goals. And you can also mobilize energies in lots of different ways, from subtle, quiet persuasion to the coercive threat or use of deadly force. Now, most often we think of leaders out front of their followers, the general rallying the troops, the presidential candidate on the podium, the guide showing the way to the followers. These are the visible paradigmatic leaders. With uniforms and insignia, they are objects of idolatry and protest. As Machiavelli said, such leaders may be loved or feared or hated, but they are rarely ignored. So that's the first kind of leadership that I want to name, leaders out front. And you can all easily think of examples of this type of leadership. CEOs in every field, presidents, governors, mayors, kings, prime ministers, sheikhs, generals. These are the leaders who come first to your mind when you think about leadership, and also the ones most prominently discussed in the leadership literature. Plato's philosopher guardians were surely visible in their leadership, even though some of the things they did were a bit underhanded. Machiavelli's prince was surely leading out front. But there are also many leaders who are much less prominent, less obviously in charge. And I'm, of course, oversimplifying things by presenting it as though there were only these two boxes, out front and behind the scenes. In the real world, leaders perform along a spectrum, from very visible, noisy, prominent leaders to those who are much quieter and much easier to ignore. But I think this oversimplification into two boxes is helpful in understanding aspects of leadership that I want to emphasize tonight. So leadership out front and behind the scenes. Now, in the examples of leaderships behind the scenes that I have in mind, it's not that the leaders wanted to be prominent and failed. Behind the scenes leadership can be provided by people who wanted to be out front and were not elected or appointed or whatever and have to exercise whatever influence they can behind the scenes, but they would much rather be out front. Or it may be that they are in a position where they actually enjoy the influence, but it's not that they are leading in the way that I will describe, the éminence grise, the Rasputin figures who stand behind the throne, or what I would call the éminence rose, the women throughout history who have a great deal of influence through pillow talk on very powerful men. Some of these folks might actually love to be in charge, but for whatever reason, they can't. Now, in contrast to such shadowy figures, the style of leadership that I'm going to be talking about is deliberately chosen. And so I will discuss 3 examples of leadership that is intentionally quiet and low-key, rather than just by default. And the 3 types I will talk about are first, what's called leading from behind, and second, the low-key leadership we sometimes associate particularly with women, and third, the organizing activities in the so-called leaderless revolutions in the Arab Spring or the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I want to look at each of those types of leadership in turn and then talk a little bit about the future for each one of them. So first, leadership in terms of leading from behind. This is a phrase we sometimes hear, but it's sort of hard to define. What does it mean to lead from behind? The best source that I know is Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. He's a leader I very much admire. And he admired the regent chief of his people. And in his childhood, he watched this chief very closely. And he acknowledges him as one of the most important influences on his own style of leadership. The chief was obviously personally visible. He was a symbol of power. But his style of leadership was very low-key. And Mandela says, and I quote, "I always remember the regent's axiom. A leader," he said, "is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble sheep go out ahead and letting the others follow, not realizing that all the while they are being directed from behind." If you want to get a sense of what it means to direct from behind, if you've ever seen a sheepdog, I was lucky enough to see one at a Nantucket sheep shearing, and sheepdogs operate from behind. Sheep are scattering all around. The sheepdogs weave back and forth and move them all into a pack and head them toward the proper goal, clearly leading from behind. But decades later, Richard Stengel, who wrote a very important biography of Mandela, observed Mandela with his own cabinet, and he encouraged everyone to talk while he listened, exercising leadership from behind. But Stengel says, and I quote, "When Mandela finally did speak at these meetings, he slowly and methodically summarized everyone's point of view, and then he unfurled his own thoughts, subtly steering the decision in the direction he wanted it to go without imposing it." And he had heard Mandela say, "It is wise to persuade people to do things and to make them think it was their own idea. That's leading from behind. The same approach can be found in Lao Tzu's classic work, the Tao Te Ching, which James McGregor Burns quotes in his book, Transforming Leadership. Bearing, yet not possessing, working, yet not taking credit, leading, not dominating. This is the primal virtue. And another passage from the Tao Te Ching, which is from the Brian Brown Walker translation, makes the point even more vividly. The best leader is one whose existence is barely known. Now, that sort of leadership is not particularly prominent in our own society. Most leaders want to be as far out front as they can. But for leaders like Mandela, one notable aspect of this leadership from behind by highly placed officials is that most of these people have a choice. They can also decide to step out front when it is to their advantage. And so Mandela wasn't always leading from behind. He could also be a very iconic, symbolic, powerful out front leader, shifting gears in a more visible, direct form. And Mandela's own leadership was often that of a man of action. Another quote, "There are times," he said, "when a leader must move out ahead of the flock, go off in a new direction, confident that he is leading in the right way." So that's the first kind of leadership behind the scenes. The second is often associated with women. And here I will rely on a report of a commission that I chaired at Princeton a few years ago at the request of President Shirley Tillman to look at how men and women undergraduates at Princeton were regarding leadership during their undergraduate years. And to fulfill our charge, we held numerous focus groups. We did a survey of the entering first-year class. We interviewed alumni as well as current students. We had a huge amount of data. And many recent alumni and current students at Princeton told us they were not interested in holding visible leadership positions like student government president or class government. These were the women students. And that they were more comfortable leading in a less prominent post, being campaign manager for a male candidate, or running for secretary or treasurer. And sure enough, in last fall's election campaign for the president of the freshman class, there were 8 male candidates and only 1 woman, and there were 6 female candidates for secretary. This is their first 2 weeks at Princeton. And women are also much more likely than men to lead cause-oriented organizations, which is a little bit different way of leading behind the scenes. It's not always behind the scenes, but it's often low-key. The organizations dedicated to the environment, to social services, to the arts, educational reform. These are the types of leadership that many women told us they preferred. High impact rather than high profile leadership. That was the term they used. And when we asked women about this, they told us that they preferred to put their efforts where they could make a difference rather than advancing their resumes or having a big title. And we were struck by how many women told us they preferred getting things done in a low-key way, concentrating on issues they cared about rather than being out front. And in this, they gave statistically significant different answers than their male peers. Their male peers were much more likely to think of leadership as something that involves being visible and being out front. But the women also gave different answers than the alumni who first made Princeton coeducational 40 years ago. They were feisty pioneers who were determined to prove that they belonged at Princeton against considerable skepticism and opposition of all these people said, they're going to destroy our male heaven here. Why should we let them in? These women were determined to prove that they belonged, and therefore they ran for everything. They were head of student government, they edited the Princetonian, they were valedictorian, they were salutatorian. They were indeed out front because they knew they had to prove that they were Princetonians. But unlike those feisty pioneers, for whatever reason, on many college campuses today and in some other settings, many women seem to prefer leadership behind the scenes rather than out front. Now, I gather this is not necessarily the case at the University of Richmond, and that you not only have a student government organization in West Hampton College, but you also have women involved across the university, which I find very encouraging. But it is true on a number of other campuses. And a recent report in the Harvard Crimson entitled "Gender Skew Persists in Student Organizations" made the same point about the same pattern. Women in certain types of organizations, but not women in the most visible posts. However, even though they said men and women lead in different spaces, it's important to note that this year at Harvard, both the president and the vice president of student government are women, and that at Princeton, the fabled Ivy Club, which was long the most obvious bastion of the male Princeton, last year had its first woman president. So things can change. It's not that all women prefer to be behind the scenes. And we know too much about the multiple styles of women leaders, including Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Indira Gandhi, to accept a generalization that all women like being low-key. In the 4th chapter of this book on leadership that I just mentioned, I argue that questions about gender differences in approaching leadership are quite vexed, and there are no easy answers. But it is nonetheless striking that in this survey of Princeton undergraduates today, we found this significant difference between men and women in their comfort with power. So that's the second type of leadership, behind the scenes. Now the third type is particularly intriguing in light of the dozens of social movements and revolutionary activities that have sprung up around the world in the last few years, from the Arab Spring through Occupy Wall Street and its offshoots around the world. These movements are sometimes described as leaderless, but to me that's an oxymoron. You can't have complex social action without somebody organizing it, somebody suggesting goals, and bringing people's energies together. Hundreds or thousands of people didn't just all happen spontaneously to decide to turn up in Tahrir Square on January 25th, 2011. They just all sort of wandered in together. That's not the way it happened. And the same thing is true about Wall Street on that same September 17th. A lot of people, activists, had been working together for months, communicating through social networks like Facebook and Twitter, organizing smaller, earlier protests, developing tactical goals, and saying, this is the day when everybody's going to be there. You come. And once the movements had begun, of course, there was a lot of organizing that needed to be done. Building an encampment, there's a lot of logistical work. You don't just all sort of spontaneously, again, decide who's going to sweep the trash up and who's going to bring the food. So there is leadership in the sense of organizing these activities and setting tactical goals. And in the case of the Arab Spring, as we know, the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and other countries have not yet had visible, charismatic leaders who have emerged as dominant figures, ready to negotiate with the powers that be and stand as the head of a new government accepted by everyone. It's true that during the movements, there were a few individuals who were powerfully influential, including Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself afire in Tunisia and launched the whole set of movements. But he did not provide leadership in the way we would usually define the term. And the same goes for the Google executive in Egypt, Wael Ghonim, who started a Facebook group called We Are All Khalil Said, to energize the growing opposition to Mubarak's regime by focusing on a young blogger who'd been beaten to death by the police. It was a very powerful, energizing moment, but he did not attempt to step forward and take visible leadership. But if you, in addition to these symbolic figures, if you think of all the young activists in the Arab Spring who remained in touch by social media and face-to-face contact when the government shut down the media, who organized the encampments and successfully overthrew the dictators who ruled their countries, motivated by their anger over unemployment and political oppression and lack of freedom, they did provide leadership in the way we usually use the term. So there appear to be a number of reasons for why their leadership was so low-key, including a philosophy of egalitarianism and democracy in this emerging sphere, which disapproves of visible leaders stepping forward and hogging the attention. But there's also the well-founded fear of being arrested and tortured and killed if you raised your head above the crowd in the Arab Spring. There's a legendary story about Tarquin, the last king of Rome, who reigned right before the establishment of the Republic. He taught his son how to deal with contenders for power by taking his sword and silently cutting off the heads of the tallest poppies in his garden. Don't raise your head above the crowd, and you're less likely to meet that fate. So the leaders of these, or in the Arab Spring, were exercising a fluid kind of leadership without visible figures that the press can identify as speaking for everyone, without long speeches or prominent authority, but it is leadership nonetheless. They've defined and clarified goals for members of a group and mobilized people's energies to pursue them. Something of the same kind occurred in Occupy Wall Street, without the same threat of torture and lengthy imprisonment. These behind-the-scenes leaders were also young activists who improvised together as the movement got underway. They were members of the tactics committees who decided where to go when the police began to press too hard on a particular site. They were the folks who organized the encampments and met the logistical challenges in cities from New York to London and around the world. In the cases of the Occupy movements, the motivation for the Lowkey Leadership was very clearly their ideological commitment to creating and living together in a fully egalitarian, truly democratic society in their camps. And having somebody step forward and tell others what to do would have been against all the things they believed and were professing. So they downplayed their roles, all these organizers, instead of allowing themselves to be anointed as leaders. And they occupied primarily through lengthy general assemblies that went on and on and on, and any opposition could prevent a decision because it all had to be unanimous. There was a stated aversion to issuing demands or specific policy objectives because they didn't want to break apart the fragile coalition of people with many different grievances who'd come together in these encampments. And they didn't want to drive some of them away by making a demand that not everybody would accept. But apart from the durable slogan of the 99%, or whatever impact this movement had on attention to increasing socioeconomic inequality in the US, which it did, there doesn't seem to be much left of the Occupy movement right now, other than a footnote to history. And I would argue that this is precisely because of their unwillingness to accept leadership in the usual sense of the word. It's not clear what the movement might have accomplished if they'd been willing to have more traditional types of leaders, to engage with the system, to work for specific policies. But it does seem that a promising movement to challenge injustices and disparities in our society will in the end come to very little unless something changes. So now, for the last section of my talk, I want to engage in some speculations about the future. What will the future be like for each of these three types of leadership? Leadership behind the scenes, as Nelson Mandela practiced it, will continue to be practiced by leaders in cultures where this kind of leadership is admired, or by particular individuals for which this leadership fits their personality. And so we can assume that some leaders, but probably not many, will always try to lead this way. But this kind of leadership is so context-specific that it's hard to set out any guiding principles or make predictions about the future. What about the other two types? Now, I would suggest that we consider three possible futures for women as leaders. In the last few decades, unlike the more distant past, dozens of women have held the most authoritative positions in the world. I talk about this in my book as well. More than 100 women have been elected president or prime minister of their countries in the last half century. And in the US, women hold all kinds of offices: senators, governors, corporate CEOs, university presidents, heads of foundations, rabbis, generals, Anglican priests, Supreme Court justices. And if you just project that same trajectory forward of what it's been like for the last few decades, starting from almost nobody doing these kinds of things to this incredible record, you might assume, well, obviously, the future will be one in which someday all top leadership posts will be gender neutral, and women will be as likely as men to hold them. And sometimes we act as though this is the obvious likely path, and the only question is how long it will take. But as Deborah Rohde of Stanford points out, quote, at current rates of change, it will be almost 3 centuries before women are as likely as men to become top managers in major corporations or achieve equal representation in the US Congress. 3 centuries is a long time to wait. Yet, you might argue, eventually we'll get there, because that's where things are moving. And you might call this path convergence toward parity. That's the first possible future. But it's important to remember that there's no guarantee that this will happen. And in an essay entitled, "You've Come a Long Way, Baby, and You've Got Miles to Go," Barbara Kellerman of Harvard sees no reason to assume that women will continue to move into demanding positions of leadership at the same rate that we did in the late 20th century. She asks us to consider the possibility that most women really don't want such jobs. As she puts it, quote, work at the top of the greasy pole takes time, saps energy, is usually all-consuming. And so maybe the trade-offs that high positions entail are ones that many women do not want. Maybe, in other words, there are fewer women senators or CEOs because women do not want what men have. Now, if Kellerman is right, as women see what these positions entail, fewer of us will decide that high-profile leadership is the way we want to spend our time, and the numbers of women in such posts will recede from the current high water mark toward something closer to the world before 1970. It would go like this. Women have proved we can do it in terms of high-powered jobs. We've seen the promised land, and most women will decide they're happier where they've been for most of their lives. So instead of convergence toward parity, you might call this scenario differential ambitions. Now, I'm dubious about Kellerman's claims. I can't prove that she's wrong, but I'm convinced that many women are not only capable of providing strong leadership, but also ambitious for doing so, and that obstacles still remain. I'm not going to go into all of them tonight, but many of them are very familiar to all of us. The difficulty of combining work and family, the discrimination that still exists. And so, if I'm right, and women are ambitious to do so, one might hope that the obstacles will indeed be overcome. In the concluding chapter of our Princeton report, which you can read online, if you go to the Princeton website, it's under the heading, Realizing Potential. In the concluding chapter, we spoke optimistically of a world in which both male and female undergraduates, and men and women more generally, would take on both kinds of leadership posts, out front and behind the scenes. Leadership of both kinds is important in getting the world's work done, and I don't think they should so often be divided along gender lines. Women should have a chance to be out front if they wish, and we should support them for this. And I think things would be better if more men also took up a share of some of the crucial work of leadership behind the scenes. So that's the kind of future for women's leadership that I like to imagine, even though I can't prove it's going to work out that way. But I do have some good intellectual ammunition on my side. In her great feminist classic, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir in 1949 reminds us that it's very hard to anticipate clearly things we have not yet seen. And in doing so, as she puts it, we often impoverish the world ahead. Let us not forget that our lack of imagination always depopulates the future. And she goes on to say, the free woman is just being born. To know how singular she will remain and how important these singularities will be, one would have to make some foolhardy predictions. But what is beyond doubt is that until now, women's possibilities have too often been stifled and lost to humanity. And in her and everyone's interest, it is high time she be left to take her own chances. So what about leadership finally in the contemporary revolutions in the Middle East and in movements like Occupy Wall Street? Since 2011, many people have been saying that the test of the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street would be whether members could find a way to define more focused goals, whether someone would step up to bring the whole group together around agreed upon policy decisions, to build a new order, to engage in the gears of the political process, so that all this mobilizing of energy could do some productive work beyond the encampment. And so far, the evidence is not encouraging. Occupy Wall Street is vanishing into obscurity, and the Arab Spring has yielded to a long, hot summer of fractious disagreements and bitter conflicts and early unsteady efforts at democracy, but as yet no sturdy new constitutions and relatively little progress toward a better world, toward those who rebelled against the old order. Now, for further evidence of what these movements might look like in the future, it's useful to look at social movements across history. I know we have a number of historians in this room, and there are important lessons to be learned from these past movements about what happens when you try to be leaderless. And I know this from personal experience as an ardent member of the second wave feminist movement in the 1970s. We all sat around somebody's living room at Stanford late into the night, drinking red wine and figuring out the curriculum for feminist studies or how we would edit a journal or setting up a new research center. It was all very exhilarating, but it took a very long time because we were dead set against leadership. We wouldn't have anybody taking decisions, speaking for the rest of us, and it was never entirely clear who was going to implement whatever decisions we finally managed to make as a group. And it was an exhilarating, inspiring, frustrating, memorable experience. We actually accomplished some very important things, but only because at the end, we were willing tacitly to accept the notion that we needed something like leadership. Leaderless activities take a lot of time, and as Oscar Wilde is supposed to have said about socialism, it takes too many evenings. So one clear lesson you can draw from second wave feminism, the Arab Spring, and Occupy Wall Street, that's quite a set. Second wave feminism, the Arab Spring, and Occupy Wall Street. But one lesson that I believe they would all yield is that there are limits to what you can accomplish without leaders, not just low-key organizers who do the logistical, tactical stuff, but leaders who are ready to step forward and provide out-front leadership. We need leaders who can devise strategies and inspire other people to follow them, who can negotiate with the powers against whom they are struggling, and provide successful transitional leadership to a new society, and take their places among other world leaders representing their people. Those folks who have participated in the Arab Spring are trying to make a revolution. And there's lots of historical evidence about successful and unsuccessful revolutionary leadership. The purpose is fighting against the established order, overturning familiar sources of legitimacy, and then establishing a durable alternative. And several of the movements in the Middle East have accomplished the first part of this dual objective. They have indeed toppled the old order, or at least the old dictator. But the key question is what happens after the former government is overthrown. And here the record, as I said, is so far not encouraging. I remember a conversation in March 2011, 2 months after Tahrir Square, with a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt, who is now a colleague, a diplomat in residence at Princeton. I was fascinated by the new movements in Egypt after Tahrir Square, and I was naively hopeful that they would soon yield a new democratic order that would make Egypt the kind of place they wanted it to be. And I eagerly asked my colleague, Daniel Kurtzer, which leaders should I keep my eye on since they're all so low-key? It's hard to figure out who one should be tracking. Who should I be looking at? He said, the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. At the time I thought, that's such a stuffy, old-fashioned response. But he was right, so far at least, the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. He knew Egypt a lot better than I did. Now, it's true that there is some evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood may be alienating enough Egyptians and making enough missteps that there will be ways in which it may implode upon itself. And it's always hard to predict the future. I think in this context of Zhou Enlai, who's supposed to have said when he was asked whether the French Revolution in 1789 had been a success, he said it's too soon to tell. I think the same thing is true about the Arab Spring. Revolutions take a long time to bear fruit. But my argument would be that unless somebody begins to step forward to give more visible leadership, it's not clear that the fruit will be very salubrious. And as far as the Occupy Wall Street movement is concerned, the activities and the animating sentiments seem to have more in common with historic theories of anarchy than with a realistic understanding of the hard work of building a new society. Anarchy, non-order, leaderlessness, is a very appealing doctrine to a number of people throughout history, which has occasionally been realized in practice. The city of Barcelona had a long history of anarchist sentiment. And indeed, in the early days of the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, it came to fruition. Barcelona was basically an anarchist community for a few months in 1936. But then the fascist troops moved in, imposing forceful order and imprisoning the low-key leaders of the movement. And in his book, Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell describes beautifully what an anarchist society was like in its heyday. He himself shared this sentiment, so he's very positive about it. And it sounds very much like Occupy Wall Street at the height of its success. If you ever talk to some of the folks who were occupying those encampments, they were modeling a new form of living together without hierarchy or authority, a feel-good kind of democratic togetherness that surely had its deep rewards for participants in Barcelona as well as Manhattan, London, and many other cities. But it is impossible to have a leaderless state for any significant period of time. Barcelona in the 30s, the Paris Commune for 2 months in the spring of 1871 were like Occupy Wall Street, notably short-lived. So in conclusion, I would remind us of Machiavelli's dictum in chapter 6 of The Prince. Armed leaders succeed, whereas unarmed ones fail. And in the same chapter, he reminds us, quote, taking the initiative in introducing new orders of things is very difficult and dangerous and unlikely to succeed. And I would argue in that same vein, as he does, that only extraordinarily capable leaders, forceful leaders, can achieve this goal. And given the point that Max Weber insists on in Politics as a Vocation, that the state involves a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, and this is what you're fighting against when you try to make a revolution, the low-key kind of leaderly activity that may bring about the fall of an individual oppressor is very unlikely to overturn the entire old order or yield a new stable set of institutions. However, low-key leadership also has clear advantages in certain situations. We need sensitive leaders, visionary people who are always pushing themselves forward. We need a more participatory democratic system in this and other countries. We need more opportunities for more citizens to contribute their ideas in a low-key way and be heard. But the key, I would argue, is knowing when leadership behind the scenes is more appropriate and when you have to step up your game, move out front, and be willing and able to exercise leadership in the more familiar sense. So, both forms of leadership are important, but they are not the same. They have different advantages and drawbacks, and each is appropriate in some contexts, but not in others. And for those of us who are students of leadership, it is good to get to bear this point in mind, to give due credit to people who exercise various forms of leadership, while also understanding more about what they require and what they can contribute to the flourishing of our communities. Thank you. So we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and I look forward very much to what's on people's minds. What are your questions? Yes?
Where do you think this leader that is necessary for the Arab Spring to come forward will come from? The ideas there?
The question is, where do I think the leader that's necessary for the Arab Spring will come from? Do I have any ideas? I don't know enough about the specific countries to give you an answer that would be informed with names and with specifics, but in terms of the type of person, my expectation would be that someone who has participated in the Arab Spring and has become disillusioned by the lack of unity and can be charismatic enough, and charisma may be important here. It isn't always important to out-front leadership, but after a revolution, I think it often is, who can be charismatic enough to step forward, clever enough to bring different groups together. It may be too late in Syria. I don't think it's too late in Egypt, where people could find the language that would allow Egyptians, who have historically been a very proud people of their history and their success as a nation, as Egyptians, to find that common ground together and to move forward without just demonizing the military or the Muslim Brotherhood, but offering a fresh perspective that has a solution to unemployment. That's not going to be easy, but somebody who has enough skill at expressing this and enough contacts to folks who can help provide the answers to make it work. And I hope that that will happen, but I cannot tell you who that would be. But I think it'll be that kind of person, relatively young, charismatic, connected enough to have different kinds of folks he or she, probably he in Egypt, can draw on, and able to put together a package that brings Egyptians with their history back to common ground. Other questions? Yes, down front.
In Egypt, is the brotherhood of the military out front because they're organized well, or because they're leaders? Please mention any of their leaders' names. So it seems to be an organization.
Another very good question. So in Egypt, are the Muslim Brotherhood and the military out front because they're leaders or because they're organized? I think the organization is crucial. And part of what I was trying to get at with my discussion about the willingness to engage in setting policies and making decisions is it also requires a framework in which you can carry forward those decisions. And you're quite right. I should have emphasized the organization more. They have the structure, they have the framework, they're already used to working together. And I'm glad you made that emendation, because I think that's one of the reasons. But clearly the military is used to providing leadership. People who know more about Egypt than I do could probably name some of the military folks who've been really important. So the organization is important, but the willingness to say we're here to provide solutions for Egypt. We believe we have the answers, and in the Muslim Brotherhood's case, we were elected, after all, to provide that leadership, and we're now willing to do so, Morsi and others. So I think it's partly that they recognize that they have the opportunity to frame policies, but you're certainly right that organization is a very important part of it. Thank you. Yes. I think you're right. There is a sense in which we are retreading old ground, but part of the problem is that with each generation, people need to be brought up to speed on the fact that there are obstacles, because for our daughters and our granddaughters, for my daughters and granddaughters, for your daughters, for several folks in this room of that age, it's easy to assume that the battles have all been fought. Oh, come on, Mom, that was your era, you know, or come on, Grandma. And it's easy to assume that the problems have all been solved and women can now do anything they want. And only when you get out into the world and are trying to work against the obstacles, whether it's work-family issues or whether it's a boss who's really not ever quite considered a woman quite as good as a man, then you realize that the battles have not all been won. And I guess the place where I think we really ought to be focusing is on bringing both women and men into the conversation about how it will not ever be possible for either women or men who want to live a good, balanced human life to do so in a society where success is measured for many professions by working 24/7, being available whenever the boss says that or the client says that, and nobody can live that way and also have a full, rich life in other aspects of a human existence. And trying to think about what a society looks like when there are possibilities for taking some time off to spend time with your kids without, and I don't mean taking off 25 years until your kid's in graduate school, but taking some time off so that you can have some time with a small child, and then going back to work and not having been discounted entirely as never serious about the future because you took 2 or 3 years off or whatever it is. I think about Pat Schroeder's famous answer when somebody said, well, how can you be a congresswoman and have a baby? And she said, I have a womb and a brain and they both work. And I mean, it's got to be a way in which we think about the world accommodating both a womb and a brain. And for men also, wanting to coach Little League, whatever it may be. I guess it's a rambling answer to your question, but I think what we haven't done enough is help young men, as well as young women, understand that there really are still problems for work-family balance. And young women understand that there's some advantages in their talking together, relying on each other, but they also have to rely on their male colleagues, friends, future husbands. So I like to think there may be a fourth wave of feminism. I know the third wave is still with us, but to me it's too much about sex and being girly and wearing high heels, and okay, that's all right, but that's not the kind of feminist future all by itself that I imagine. So I would hope that some of the folks in this room and some of my students at Princeton would be at the head of a fourth wave of feminism that would get beyond some of the stale old debates. And I think the leaning in and Anne-Marie Slaughter's stuff is a way of bringing us all back to the table to talk about the conversation. But I have a Princeton student, a senior, who's doing her thesis about the policies that make it possible for women to work and stay in the workforce after their children are born, and by an accident of her survey, which was done by a group that pays people to take surveys, you would expect then that the survey is left skewed, that by far the largest proportion of her respondents were low income. I mean, people who have the kinds of jobs many of us do are not going to have somebody pay us $10 to take a survey. And so she has tapped into a population that the discussion with Anne-Marie and Cheryl and others has not, which is women, some of whom do not have fascinating jobs and would love to stay home with their children if they could, or others who could have much more rewarding jobs if it were possible for them to balance work and family better. And she's finding out some really interesting things and putting a different voice on the table. So I just think we have to remind people that the struggle is not over, but that there are people of goodwill who are trying to engage in it, and it has to be both women and men. It's not a novel answer, but I think it's important for all of us to keep that in mind. You have another question? Anybody else who hasn't spoken? Go ahead.
Clergy and the military, how have they changed since women have been more involved in organizations and teaching leadership?
How have the clergy and the military been more involved in the organizations? There's probably somebody at the Jepson School who knows the answer to that question straight off. All I can do is speculate. I think that, at least in the religious organizations that I know, having women involved has, in some cases, put more emphasis on pastoral concerns and on sensitivities. I certainly don't believe that all women operate that way, but some women at least do, and that may be one thing that's happened. I think more important for clergy situations, all the people in a congregation can look at that authority figure and say, I could be there. That person looks like me. That person shared my background and my experiences. And if that never is true for you, it's really hard to imagine yourself doing such a thing. So for a young woman who sees a very competent woman, priest or rabbi or minister, and says, consciously or unconsciously, you know, that's something I could do. Whereas for people in the generation I grew up in, all those figures were male and just assumed that's a male activity. And God is male and the preachers are male and everybody's male, and here I am, a little figure in the congregation. And that's different. And on the military, I think it's been very interesting because even though it's clear that not all women are nearly as strong as all men, there are many women who can undertake a number of the activities in modern technological warfare just as well as men, and some who are physically capable as many men. And to have that be true and to get past the old shibboleth that you can't have men and women in the same combat force because they'll stop thinking about fighting and only thinking about sex, and to prove that in fact people can be effective colleagues in that organization as well as in others. That seems to be sort of the ultimate limit. If you can do it there, then it's almost easy to say, well, you can do it anywhere. I think that's been one of the main advantages. Yes? One of my granddaughters is on the sailing team at Bowdoin, which is co-ed. And it's very important that it's co-ed. There's no particular reason to have women's and men's sailing teams. And I think that's true for a number of sports. Track. I don't think it's true for football. And I'm not sure about basketball because there are sports where men, their height, their strength, their upper body strength is going to make a difference. But I do think that having more inter-squad skirmishes where the women and the men play together, and for younger people, for kids, having more activities where the boys and the girls soccer, whatever it may be, are spending time together is good. But I think this would be one area where there probably are still reasons why there are men's sports and women's sports, but that doesn't mean that one should be rewarded with more money and more space and more fans. I thought you were going to ask a different question about whether we should have done Title IX, recognizing that it didn't say anything specifically at the beginning about athletics, whether we should have used it more broadly to think about the way universities might need to change. As a college president, I would have shrunk from saying that because it would make my life much more difficult. But now, as a faculty member, I can say, wouldn't it be interesting to think about Title IX in science or Title IX in some activities where women are still, despite their clear qualities and achievements, discriminated against? And I served on one of the most formative experiences for me recently was serving on a National Academy of Sciences committee on women in the faculties in science and engineering. And why, you all have probably seen this pattern, which I find quite disturbing. In almost every field, not computer science, not certain parts of physics, but in almost every other field, women are the same numbers as men, as majors in their undergraduate lives, as PhDs, and even as postdocs. But when they come to take their first job after graduating, it's not a pipeline, it's not a glass, it's a cliff. Women just fall off the cliff. Fewer of them apply for these assistant professorships. Fewer of them stand for jobs in the demanding law firms. And so the real problem is, what is happening at that point? And some of it is what we were talking about before, the difficulty of balancing work and family, and you sort of become aware of this. But I think it's also still discrimination in what hiring committees are looking for, what people think their colleagues should look like, should be like. So I think taking Title IX seriously in some other fields might be helpful, but I certainly don't think of it as a cure-all. Yes? Okay, another good question, Colin. I would make a distinction here between what I would call popular culture, broadly construed. Most TV shows, not all, the way the internet websites often present women, and the way women are discussed in the more casual popular media. You rarely see a woman in uniform, a woman in a lab coat, a woman making a decision. You see women being sexy and appealing and soft and sort of batting their eyelashes at men. And as long as that's the image of women in popular culture, the Barbie doll image, it's very easy to see why women, young girls, will not think of themselves as potential clerics or members of the military or whatever, because they never see any women doing that, certainly not in the popular media. But I think there are also ways in which this is getting better. I mentioned to Joanne earlier, I was reading I think it was the Saturday New York Times on my way down here. And there were 3 stories about women leaders in that one edition of the Saturday Times. One was about Margaret Thatcher, who we know was hardly a shrinking violet. She was an amazing leader. I have a case study about her in my graduate course on leadership at the Woodrow Wilson School, which is a really fascinating case. And we revisited it after she died because it was later in the semester. But the particular story in the New York Times was partly in your camp and partly in mine. Not your camp, but partly makes your point and partly mine, because it was about the fact that the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead has gone to the top of the charts of music in Britain right now because people called Margaret Thatcher the witch. And so here's this way of seeing the death of a great woman leader as a cathartic opportunity to bash her in retrospect, which is a very interesting thing to stop and think about. It's not impossible to think of that happening to a male leader, but there's a kind of an edge to it, which is worrisome. The second article was different, but equally thought-provoking. It makes both your point and mine. It was about the new president of South Korea, who is a woman in a very sexist society. I was saying I've never been in a society as sexist. Maybe it's just my experience. But it was the only place I traveled as president of Duke where the male alums just didn't know how to handle a woman president. It never occurred to them they'd have to deal with that when I was being hosted. So they all talked to my man vice president. What do you think she would like? And he would say, hey, she's right there. Why don't you ask her? And so this is a very sexist society. I'm sure there are many parts of South Korea that aren't. And when I was there as Wellesley's president, I was beautifully hosted by husbands of Wellesley alums. But anyway, the reason I thought about it, I think of it as quite a sexist society. Here's this woman who's now head of it, which is a very unexpected phenomenon. But she's very tough, clearly. But people are saying, oh, she's not really a woman. She's channeling her father, the dictator that we admired. So it's just in a woman's body. It's her father in a woman's body. Or she's a neuter president. So this is how they're handling it. The third story was about a woman who's been elected head of a community garden in New York. And she's cleaning house, so to speak. She's trying to enforce some rules that have never been enforced before. And people are up in arms. This is our garden. We should do whatever we want. So these were the 3 women who were featured in that one edition of the New York Times. And as I say, they partly make your point, because even though these women are very strong and very tough, the popular culture, in this case of the New York Times, is reporting how people are filtering through the kind of media attention you are talking about, even though the Times didn't treat them that way. But maybe you all should become journalists and see what you can do about changing the media. You also had a question.
As the president of the university, you came across a lot of popular decisions. What advice do you have for leaders who are facing controversial decisions?
Advice for leaders who are facing controversial decisions and dealing with the consequences. How much time do you have? I think one of the things I would say is, and the question about time was double-edged. It partly depends on how much time you have. If it's an emergency, if it's a crisis, but there's a controversial decision that you have to make, it's harder than if you have some time to think about it, if you have some time to consult people, if you have the time to pave the way for a decision that you're making. That doesn't necessarily make it easier or more popular with some of the people who won't like it, but it allows you to bring some folks in with you and get people prepared for the answer. So I found it helpful to have time and take time when I had it. But you should never take too much time. One fault that leaders often have is they wait until they have a little more information. You could always get more information, but at some point you just got to go ahead, fish and cut bait, because that's it. And knowing, one of the greatest things about leadership is having a sense of when that timing is. So in a controversial decision, knowing that at some point you're just going to have to decide, and not everybody will be happy with it. But I always found it useful to reach out to people that I knew wouldn't like the decision, but that I wanted to let them know that I was making it, so that they would be prepared even if they didn't agree. So that one example was, Duke is a Methodist-affiliated university, but the chapel is a chapel for the whole university. So the question arose, can same-sex marriages be celebrated in the chapel? And this was right after the Methodist Church had gone strongly on record saying that same-sex marriages were not according to Methodist doctrine. But on the other hand, here's the chapel of the whole university, and there were some chaplains, the Reformed Judaism, the Unitarians, who were quite ready to perform same-sex marriages. So I was mulling this over and talking, of course, to the chaplain, but I had come to the decision that the right answer was to allow those who, in their religious traditions, believed that this was okay, to sanctify marriages of students who also wanted to get married. But I knew this was going to be a very unpopular decision among lots of folks. And so I reached out to the bishops of the Methodist Church. And I said, this is something I'm pondering, and this is where I'm likely to come out, but I wanted you to be aware of it. Here are my reasons. This is why I'm thinking of doing it. I didn't want you to be blindsided. Read it in the press. And I also used a couple of bishops on my board who agreed with me to reach out to others. And I consulted a couple of major donors who I knew would be very unhappy, simply told them what I was going to do. One of them said, I'll never give $1 to Duke again, and maybe hasn't. But the other said, I don't agree with it, but I see what you're trying to do. So consulting people, giving people some advance warning, making the decision in a timely fashion, getting it out there, living with it, and not looking back, not second-guessing yourself. Because after you've made a controversial decision, you'll get a lot of contact and a lot of folks who are after you. But if you've made the right decision in your own mind, and you've taken this, and you've had the time to take the steps I mentioned, you don't look back, you move on. And that was the way I handled it. So, what's the story? We have time for one more question? Is there one more question? Yes. I will do that, and then you had a question. I'll give a short answer, and I'll give you a short answer, too. What was your question?
So mine is just, talks about two different leadership styles, and one, frequently, it's women have that leadership style. And I was curious, does the leader who always wants to be out in front always win over the other side? And as people who are professors, and we're seeing this even with our students, how do we make it so that students can lead even when they're leading from?
Okay. Mike Krzyzewski and Shirley Tillman. They are both, talk about leaders, they are both very strong out front leaders and people I admire very much. Mike Krzyzewski, I assume everybody in the room knows, but in case you don't, is the legendary basketball coach of the men's basketball team at Duke. And he is a winning coach, and he's a very strong coach, but a very beloved coach. And he is by far better known than the president of Duke, makes more money. That was okay with me. But the main thing was that he understands that he's at a university, and he cares about academics as well as athletics. That didn't mean there weren't sometimes times when there was tension at the margin about people traveling during exams or whatever. But he gets it. I admire him very much. We very rarely disagreed. And he's an amazing leader and a really inspirational and charismatic coach. And he cares so much about his students and about Duke. Shirley Tillman is one of the best university presidents I've ever seen. She's also beloved at Princeton, very different from Mike, but very successful. She is an excellent scholar. She teaches a course. Students love her. The faculty think we're really lucky to have a president like that. I've heard very, very few people criticize Shirley Tillman about anything. She still sometimes makes decisions that folks don't like, and some of her administrators don't agree with everything she's done, but the board is totally behind her, and the alumni think she's great. And she's a no-nonsense person, but she's very warm, and she comes to all kinds of things. Maybe because Princeton isn't a huge university, she comes to lots of events, department events, whatever. And she also has a very straightforward, quick wit. So there was an article, there was an op-ed contribution to the Princetonian, our daily newspaper, by a Princeton alum, a woman, who was saying to the young women at Princeton, so all this academic stuff is all very well, but the main thing you should have in mind at Princeton is finding a husband, because you'll never again be with so many smart people, and the older you get, the less appealing you will be. Your marriage market is going to dry up. So take advantage of it, particularly freshman and sophomore year. So Shirley Tillman was asked to comment on this, and she said, Princeton is an educational institution, not a marriage bureau. Next question. So that's Shirley. In terms of your question about both kinds of leadership, I'm sure that there are opportunities sometimes when out front leaders who are mostly bluster and mostly like the Wizard of Oz and not really solid can be outmaneuvered by people who are much more low-key, who are smarter, who are savvy, who are good at cultivating their following, whatever. I can't think of any examples right now, but I'm sure many of the people in the room can. But I think that people who have a low-key leadership in such a contest do have a handicap, unless they're clearly superior in some ways of strategizing and appealing to their followers, even in a low-key way. Because if you're out front, if you're at the podium, I mean, just look at me and look at you all. I mean, I'm at the podium, you're all looking at me. I'm looking at you, but it's different. And I think that's the sort of thing that's hard to get around. So yes, it can happen, but you start with a bit of a disadvantage. But there was a second part to your question.
Right, so I see this with our students where we'll have a male.
Oh, right, right.
They're a female leader, but she's more behind the scenes.
Yeah.
How do we foster?
Thank you. That's a very good question to end on. How do we foster behind-the-scenes leadership as well as out-front leadership? And I think for women students who are seriously interested in behind-the-scenes leadership, who want to run an environmental organization and not be terrifically visible about it and give credit to other people, the main thing that we should do is to celebrate their kind of leadership, recognize the influence that it has within the university and the impact that it can have, and make sure the university credits and honors people who show low-key leadership so that not everybody has to be visible and out front. And give people the credit and the recognition for that kind of leadership as well. But for the women who might actually like to be out front and who find that they are discouraged by their male peers, because we heard this in our Princeton study too, women who said, I would love to have run for student government president or editor of the Princetonian, but some guys told me, you know, that's not a woman's job, you shouldn't do that. For those women, we should be helping them develop the backbone and the presence and the sense of support so that they can go out, they can learn to campaign, they can learn to knock on doors, they can build their self-confidence. And that's the last note I would end on. Self-confidence is a huge asset for leaders. I wasn't born with it. Very few of us are born with it. But I think women sometimes find it harder to develop self-confidence because of the kind of popular culture factors that Colin was asking about. Because you don't see a lot of self-confident, bold women out there. So helping women develop their self-confidence and saying, you really should go for it. You know, you're really good at this. I think about people who apply for Rhodes and Marshall Scholars. And having taught in all these universities that Joanne mentioned, I've often been consulted by potential Marshall Scholars because I was a Marshall myself, or Rhodes folks. And I have 3 sons, so I can say this without, I hope, being misunderstood. But I've never had a young man who I thought would make a great Rhodes Scholar, who was sort of standing in the background, and I went to him and I said, you really ought to apply for a Rhodes. Say, oh, who, me? I really couldn't be a Rhodes Scholar. Whereas I've had more women than I can tell you who have said that. I've had other men who think they're God's gift to Cecil Rhodes, even though, you know, they don't have a snowball's chance in hell. Whereas women really often have to be encouraged to stand for a Rhodes Scholarship. They don't think of it as something they could do. Now, clearly that's an overgeneralization, but it's in my experience, it's pretty it's pretty common. So having women understand that they can actually go for something and they will get the support and they have a chance to do it, and having men understand, yes, we think it's great that you're going to do this, you're very self-confident, but not overstate their strengths when they're really unaware of what the competition is going to be like or whatever. And when the woman behaves more like that typical man and a man behaves more like that typical woman, they need the different medicine. And that's the way we should do it. So, thank you.
I'm Sandra Peart, the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my pleasure now to close this program. We first began planning the Groundbreakers series almost 2 years ago, and the very first name suggested was Nan Keohane. I think you'll all agree with me that she was a fabulous choice to close the Jepson School of Leadership Studies Groundbreakers series this year. Please join me in thanking Nan Keohane. I'd like as well to thank Joanne Chula and Al Gothos. Every year we have 2 faculty members who sort of take charge and lead the forum series, and Joanne and Al were the 2 faculty members who did so this year. They did a great job. I think we put together a really good speaker series, so please join me in thanking Joanne and Al. Every year, Shannon Best does a really good job of putting on events of this sort. We just had a very complicated set of events on Friday. She's back here Monday morning putting together today's event. Shannon, thanks very much. She's in the back of the room. I want as well to let you know that looking forward, we have cultural leadership as our topic for next year. Kristen Bazzaio and Peter Kaufman are taking the lead on that one, and we have Moises Kaufman, as well as the playwright, as well as a lineup of another 4 or 5 speakers. It'll be a really fabulous series. We've never, at least as far as I know, done cultural leadership, so I think it's going to be really interesting. So please just check the website, look for invitations, and come to any and all events as you're able. If you would like to now, you can adjourn to a reception that we'll be holding just directly to your left as you exit the room. And as well, I should let you know that Nan will be ready to sign Thinking About Leadership. So if you'd like to get a copy of that book, please do so. Thanks very much and good evening.